Let's come to our first keynote session, Silicon Valley 2.0, the rise of super angels. How will this generation of angels create more funding for entrepreneurs? Now, presenting this session is Naval Ravikant. Now, the official blurb, it says, super angel, founder of AngelList, and investor in Twitter and Force. Ladies and gentlemen, Naval Ravikant.
All right. Well, thank you for having us as a guest in your wonderful country. I hope that what we have to say is at least somewhat relevant, although we tend to get trapped in our own Silicon Valley way of thinking and speaking. It's a very small, unusual place, and I hope to bring some of what's going on over there to you here. Unfortunately, I cannot bore you for an hour and 15 minutes. I just don't have it in me, so we'll probably switch to Q&A because I'll probably be done within about 20 to 30 minutes. Hopefully what I'm saying is of some relevance. This is a presentation that I have been giving for the last year and change, and I've modified it over time because things keep changing so quickly. And the background where it comes from is that I actually run a site called AngelList, which we started about 18 months ago, 20 months ago now actually. And it started as a small mailing list of 25 angel investors that I knew and some startups that I knew that were raising money, and we would sort of connect the two of them together. And since then it has exploded, and we now have about 3,000 investors on AngelList, including about 1,000 venture capitalists, including some of the top VC firms in Silicon Valley like Andreessen Horowitz and Matrix Partners and Greylock and Accel and so on and so forth. And we've had about 12,000 startup companies apply to AngelList to raise money in that period of time, of which many hundreds have been successfully funded. And today we estimate that roughly 1 or 2 companies are meeting and raising money from investors on AngelList every single day. We make about 300 to 500 introductions between startups and investors every week, and it's growing very rapidly. And really what we think of ourselves as doing is bringing the Silicon Valley ecosystem online. And making it accessible to the whole world. So you may recognize some of the names of people who are on AngelList in these slides. Some of the companies that you might know, but some of the better known ones are companies like Uber and BranchOut and Pinterest that have raised money on AngelList. 7 of the companies that have raised money have been acquired. There are also M&A groups operating on AngelList. So we're basically just trying to make Silicon Valley more transparent, more efficient, more online, and make the funding process itself more efficient. And to those of you who are entrepreneurs, you all know how frustrating raising money is. It seems like it's this really hard black box problem of who you know. And it just doesn't seem modern compared to how we write code. You know, we write our code and we put it on GitHub. We take our binaries and we host them on Amazon. We do our marketing and our outreach to our customers and our clients through Twitter and Facebook and Google. And then when it comes time to raising money, it's all about meeting this guy in a suit who introduces you to that guy in a suit. And then maybe there's a coffee meeting, and then there's a handshake, and God knows what goes on. So we're trying to make all that simpler, more transparent, more efficient. And so in doing that, we've learned a lot about the angel investing ecosystem. And a lot of what we do wasn't even possible 2 years ago, and some things have fundamentally changed. So in 2007, the Silicon Valley investing ecosystem changed. And it changed in a fundamental way, and these angels rose up, and they actually took a lot of the traditional funding out of venture capital hands, and they actually became responsible for a lot of the early stage financing in Silicon Valley. Angels used to be about friends and family, a few people that you knew who would give you money. But these so-called professional angels, these super angels showed up. And I want to talk about why that happened and what that means for you as entrepreneurs. So it's always good to be controversial. So I like this Jordan Bernard Shaw quote that all great truths become as blasphemies. So, you know, first they make fun of you, and then eventually they fight you, and then you win. I think that's I'm mangling Gandhi there. But essentially what I'm trying to say is that this is actually a relatively controversial point of view, or what used to be. People talk about how Silicon Valley changes the world, but I would argue that now the tools that Silicon Valley has built to change the world have caused a transformation in Silicon Valley itself. And there has been a revolution. And the revolution started in 2007, and people talk about it as the angel investors came in and took away a lot of the traditional deal flow from VCs, or from venture capitalists. But actually, it's a little different. What's really happened is entrepreneurs have gained a lot more power in Silicon Valley. And the reason this is relevant to you in Malaysia is because not just in Silicon Valley, entrepreneurs have gained power relative to financiers and finance all over the world. And I know that sounds very hard to believe because you're probably sitting in here thinking, how on earth can I raise money for my company? But the reality is that you have a lot more power in that regard than you have ever had. And the reason is because we live in what I call the age of free leverage. Leverage is a very, very important concept. If you're doing a company today, if you're doing technology today, the reason you are doing it, the reason you are able to do it is because you have so much leverage. Leverage, in its simplest form, there was a Greek philosopher, Archimedes, and he said, give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, and I will move the earth. And so what leverage does is it amplifies your power. It says, whatever I could do, I can now do it 10 times better or 100 times better because I have leverage. And as an entrepreneur, leverage is your friend. Leverage is what gives you the power to do what you want to do to change the world. And so how do you get leverage? Well, traditionally, what used to happen was leverage was available to you in only one of two ways, and that was capital or money or labor, people. So if you wanted leverage, you went out and you had to manage a whole bunch of people. You had to get them to work for you. Or you had to go to some rich capitalist and beg them for money. And by the way, this is why your mother tells you to go run a big company and have hundreds of people working for you, because she understands at a core level that that's leverage. Every one of your actions in a big company is magnified by a few hundred corporate drones working for you underneath. But that's not necessarily the only way to get leverage. And the Industrial Revolution came along, and it was an age where we added machines. We had industrial productivity coming out of factories, and there was a huge struggle between the workers and the capitalists, and this is when socialism came up and Karl Marx became popular, because there was this new form of leverage, which is factory-based production, and people were fighting over it. They were trying to figure out who is going to get the gains from this leverage. And the beautiful thing about the 20th century and the 21st century is that we have created a new form of leverage, and that is intellectual property. And books, movies, and music are examples of that. So a musician now can play their music once, it can be recorded, it can be broadcast to millions of people, and every time, every one of those people can enjoy the new performance with no additional cost by watching it online or watching it on a DVD or listening to it on CD. And so that is a form of leverage. But there are many more forms of leverage, and as entrepreneurs, your favorite form of leverage should be code. Writing code is a form of leverage. You sit there on your desk, you write a piece of software once, and every time it is executed all around the world, it doesn't cost you anything, but there is a huge benefit to the person who gains it. And that really has created the wealth under Silicon Valley. Code as a form of leverage is what has allowed entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley who are unknown people, from Jerry Yang and David Filo to Larry Page and Sergey Brin to Steve Jobs, who have made huge fortunes because they created something once, and through the leverage that comes from intellectual property and code, it got reused over and over and over again. And as entrepreneurs in this generation, you are luckier than any generation that came before you because you have gained additional new forms of leverage. There are entire platforms for entrepreneurship that are emerging. And what we have done is we have taken the code that has been written over the last few decades and we've made it available in packaged forms to entrepreneurs. So there are intellectual property platforms. The operating system that runs on your iPhone in everyone's pocket right now has all this embedded leverage in it. It's all this code that's been written by the engineers at Apple that you can use very easily and simply and cheaply. Open source software is another example. When I started my first company, I had to buy servers from Sun, I had to buy software from Oracle. Let me tell you, it was very expensive and very painful. But today you can use Linux and Apache and MySQL to do that. We've lost visual. Please stand by. There we go. All right, we're back. Should I start over? No. If you look at Facebook, if any of you are building applications on top of the Facebook or Twitter APIs, that is a form of intellectual property leverage. So now large companies have become used to taking the leverage that they've got through code and making that available to an army of developers and entrepreneurs such as yourselves. Similarly, there are labor platforms emerging now. If you want to actually have people do work, in the old days you'd have to hire those people. They'd have to sit in your office. But now you can use Mechanical Turk. You can use communities to do the work, as YouTube did, as Wikipedia does, as Quora does. So there are ways for you to get people to do the work for you online in little bits and pieces, or even for free, as opposed to having to hire them as full-time salaried employees. And finally, especially in Silicon Valley, we can get a little signal here. Oh. There we go. We have capital platforms. So AngelList is a way for you to meet investors and raise money from angel investors. Kickstarter is a way for you to raise money for your products that you're building, almost sell them in advance of having built them. A lot of the incubators that we're seeing, like IO Ventures, represented by Paul Bragiel, aka Grizzly Adams up there, and Techstars and Y Combinator and so on, are actually providing forms of leverage to the entrepreneurs who take part in those institutions. So as an entrepreneur, you are living in an age and time when there's an enormous amount of leverage available to you, and this is changing the power balance between entrepreneurs and financiers. At the same time, you have the benefit of incremental production. If you remember back in the Windows software days, if you were writing desktop software for Windows or for the Mac, you would have to write it, and then it would take you 6 months or 12 months to build it, and then you would release it in one big bang. But today, you don't do 1.0 releases anymore. You're always releasing, you're always deploying, you're always building things in little chunks. Even the people who are working for you are working for you in little chunks. All right, this is not being friendly. Come on. We don't need it anyway. And even the people who are raising money now are raising money in little chunks as they go. The classic thing in Silicon Valley right now for entrepreneurs is not to do a single large VC round, but rather to raise $50,000, $100,000 checks from individuals every month, every 2 months as they come in. So that whole thing is changing. So basically what has happened here is entrepreneurs have gained a lot more power. They've gained that power through leverage. That leverage has come through these new platforms that provide you capital, that provide you people and labor, and that provide you code on an as-needed basis that you can deploy incrementally. And entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley have used that power in that negotiation with their investors. And what happened was the classic venture capitalist, you would go in, you would meet some guy who's in a suit, you know, they got a nice tie, and they're sitting in some beautiful glass and mahogany and steel offices, and they would listen to you, and it would be a very difficult thing for you as an entrepreneur. You'd go from meeting to meeting to meeting, and they'd be judging you. And then if you got lucky, maybe you would get a term sheet, and it would take you a few months to negotiate. And as part of that term sheet, the investor would essentially buy control of your company. They would bundle advice, control, and money together, and now, congratulations, as an entrepreneur, you had a boss. And that is changing. So entrepreneurs took this additional leverage they had, and they used it to basically renegotiate the terms. And these are the new terms that they demanded. And I will not bore you with all of them, but it's an implicit Bill of Rights. There's no explicit Bill of Rights. Nobody sat down and wrote the whole thing. But there's an implicit Bill of Rights or understandings that entrepreneurs wanted with their investors. And so that actually enabled the rise of the angel investor, because the VCs did not adapt fast enough. And venture capital itself is a business. And because it is a business, it is subject to attack from startups who have different business models. And these angel investors were essentially startups who attacked the VC business model, and in the process changed the VC industry and changed Silicon Valley itself. I used to have a blog called Venture Hacks, I still do, which is all about how to negotiate venture capital. But the truth is a lot of it's irrelevant and obsolete today, because venture capitalists now behave a lot more like angel investors. They give much more favorable terms. They buy a lot less control, and that has happened because the entrepreneurs forced them to do so, the angels forced them to do so, and they were finally subject to some competition. So this is a beautiful example of how Silicon Valley created a set of tools that then transformed Silicon Valley itself. And I think that's part of the beauty and dynamicism of that part of the world. So this is the good news. The good news is that as entrepreneurs, we have a lot more power and leverage with venture capitalists these days. It's still not easy. Only a very small fraction of companies get funded. The vast majority of companies fail. And if anything, the problem with all this leverage and tools is that it's become very easy to start a company, a lot easier than it used to be. So everyone's got a company in their back pocket. Everyone thinks they can create the next Facebook or YouTube or Google. Everyone's coding away. And whatever you can think of, there are hundreds and hundreds of copies of it. So the flip side is, it might be, if you're one of these companies that does well, it's extremely easy to raise money, but the majority of the companies still have a very hard time because there's so many of them. So if you look at this slide, what I'm basically trying to say is that there's in mathematical terms, there's a power law distribution to the outcome of the companies. What that basically means is there's a few companies that do extremely well, and we have some of their founders sitting in the front aisle over here. And then the majority of them are down there in the noise, and it's very, very hard to rise up out of that noise. So it doesn't necessarily make life easier for you as an entrepreneur unless you happen to be one of the success cases. Another thing that has happened because of this, this change in Silicon Valley is that we have created all these incubators now around the world. It's gotten a lot cheaper to build a company. What used to cost $3 million to build, or the equivalent, before you could launch a product, now costs $100,000 or $300,000 to build. And so because of that, we've had these rise of these incubators, started most famously Y Combinator, but eventually Techstars and IO Ventures and AngelPad. And there's now 100 of them in Silicon Valley, and there's probably a couple opening up here in Malaysia too. And I encourage you to embrace these incubators. At first, I was as skeptical as anybody because the incubator model had been tried back in 2000 and had failed spectacularly back then, with a few notable exceptions. But today, the way to think about these incubators is because you don't need that much money, because you have so much leverage through code, these incubators really are the new graduate schools. So it used to be that if you wanted to start a company, you were told, go get your MBA, go to school, go get your master's, and that's where you learn. But the reality is, as we know as entrepreneurs, going to school is not about learning how to be innovative. Schools generally tend to force you to be conformist. They're places of peer pressure, where you're judged by your peers, you have to be popular, you have to do what's right, what you're told, where you're judged and graded on very artificial characteristics. So they're not breeding grounds for entrepreneurship. But rather, these incubators are the new graduate schools. And there are some very key differences between them and the existing graduate schools for the better. And I think that 50 years from now or 100 years from now, every major university will have its own technology or startup or entrepreneurial incubator, because that will be viewed as an essential part of the educational process. And in fact, in that list that I have up here, StartX is the incubator at Stanford. Founder School is the incubator at Berkeley. Stanford actually is opening a second one. It's not really Stanford itself. It's a student organization at Stanford that are creating these incubators. And these incubators are roughly 3-month programs where you go in, you work alongside your peers, and you're expected to start a company in 3 months from scratch. You're expected to assemble your team, build your product, and launch it, and then go out and raise funding. And it's a very compressed time scale. It's very high intensity, and it's an incredible experience, and I highly recommend it for all of you. The beauty of these incubators, as opposed to the old graduate school way of doing things, is you get paid to go to school. You don't have to pay anymore. The cost of a graduate degree from a Stanford University equivalent today is probably around $200,000, which will put you in debt for an extremely long time. But if you go to one of these incubators, you will get somewhere between $25,000 to $200,000 on graduation for your company, which is a pretty amazing thing when you think about it. When you get out, you are not expected to go hunting for a job. You are expected to go out and create jobs for other people. So it is completely flipping the school model on its head. And you are not expected to do the work that your professor tells you to do. You are not expected to follow in the footsteps of great people before you. You are expected to do something original and do it well. So you have to create something of value for society that it has not seen before. And finally, you are not being graded by a professor and their whims, you're being graded by the real world. And so what you do is, best case, you start a company, you change the world, you accomplish your life's dreams. But worst case, you learn by actually creating something. And in many cases, the professors teach by doing something. At the Berkeley incubator, which is called Founder School, the professor, who is a former entrepreneur who runs the Founder School. He has 6 companies that he is incubating of students. He himself is starting a company at the same time. He is teaching by doing. And he shows his students, hey, I'm trying to do this, I failed on this, I succeeded on that. Imagine if your professor actually had to do the work themselves from scratch every time. It would be a very different kind of experience. So this is what's really going on in Silicon Valley today and makes Silicon Valley startup scene so exciting. Thousands and thousands of small companies are being formed. They're being built very, very cheaply. They're being incubated. They're raising money online. They're using capital platforms. They're using labor platforms. They're using technology platforms to do things faster and cheaper and easier than better. better than ever. And of course, there are so many of them being created, there's an enormous amount of noise. So all of us are saying, how is this sustainable? How many of these can be there? But it's really an incredible phenomenon. There's a lot of frothiness, there's a lot of activity. So now I want to stop talking about Silicon Valley, internals and how Silicon Valley works, because all I'm doing so far is convincing you to get on a plane and go to Silicon Valley, which is not necessarily the answer. I want to talk about what this means for you here, because I think the things that are causing Silicon Valley to remake itself are fundamental in nature, and they're not going to be restricted just to Silicon Valley, and you are going to feel its impact here as well. So this is where I'm going to go out a little bit on a limb. And I think that here you have a lot of opportunity that in some ways we don't have in Silicon Valley. Danny Hillis famously defined technology as he said, technology is everything that doesn't work yet. In fact, Douglas Adams, who's the author of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, had a very funny saying. He said, if something was created before you were born, it's not technology, right? You're just used to it. That's just life. If something is created before you the age of 30, it's really exciting and new, and if you get into it, maybe you can build a career out of it, and that's technology. And if something is created after you're the age of 30, then it is suspicious and not to be trusted and maybe a little dangerous, until about 10 years pass, and you figure out, well, it's not so bad, really. It's okay. I can live with it. And you can apply this formula to movies, railroads, music, code, personal computers, and cell phones to figure out how old you are. So it's a good way to slot yourself into the technology regime. But what's interesting about this definition is it doesn't say that something has to be computers and microchips and all that stuff to be technology. Technology is just simply something that society has not yet figured out how to do well, hasn't yet figured out how to scale. So you could argue that Steve Jobs came along and he looked at the cell phones and he said, these are terrible, this is broken, these don't work properly. And so he solved the technology problem by creating the iPhone, whereas most of us would have probably already considered cell phones to be high-tech. He looked at the previous generation of cell phones and did not consider them technology. So the good news in part of the world that is emerging, like here we are at the gateway to Asia, is that there are a lot more things here that don't quite yet work. For example, if you go to India, there is no working FedEx or UPS. So a lot of the logistics infrastructure doesn't work. So a technology entrepreneur can go into India and try and figure out how to make the logistics infrastructure work. And that is a technology problem that they're solving. So the set of problems that you have available to you to solve here are greater. And so the scope for technical innovation is larger. The markets here are much, much larger. And what Silicon Valley has taken advantage of is a whole confluence of factors that have made it great. But I would argue that those factors, they're not being diminished. Silicon Valley will continue to be great, but many of those factors are now becoming available to other parts of the world. And so what is it that people think makes Silicon Valley so great? I've got a little fuzzy picture of the Stanford Quad back there, which is sort of the Palo Alto. It's the ground zero for Silicon Valley. And people have always come up with all kinds of reasons why they think Silicon Valley worked. One of those is weather. It is actually really good weather. It's always sunny all year round. There's, barely rains. It's not humid at all. So, that's always been thrown out there as a reason. The university system at Berkeley and Stanford, people have cited that as a big reason. Huge local markets. The United States is a giant market of lots of consumers who are driven on the debt-driven binge and frenzy of buying, an orgy of capitalism that lasted for a few decades, and now that's sort of coming to an end. But we've had great markets. Lots of money has been available. Sand Hill Road, if you've heard of it, is where all the venture capitalists hang out in their beautiful offices with lots of cash available for startups. There's an incredible ecosystem of entrepreneurs and all the people surrounding them, attorneys and real estate people and accountants and marketers and just all the people that you need to make to build a startup company. There's a culture of risk and creativity. Although I kind of hate this point, to be honest. I think entrepreneurs are everywhere. I think entrepreneurship is inherent in the human spirit. And it's only since the Industrial Revolution that we've even gotten used to working in large groups for other people and having hierarchies. At the end of the day, I think every child is born an entrepreneur, and then we slowly snuff it out of them. And then finally, in Silicon Valley, you've had this tremendous history of success. Hewlett-Packard and Intel and Fairchild and Sun started it off, but it's created just hundreds and hundreds of companies. And I remember my realization when I first got to Silicon Valley it was sort of the opposite of what you would expect. I was in New York. I'd gone to school out there on the East Coast, and I got to Silicon Valley, and I looked around, and I talked to some people, and I said, wow, these people really aren't that smart. And they don't really work that hard. I mean, I was on the East Coast, and there were people in investment banks who'd come out of Harvard, who were coming out of Boston University or MIT or Columbia, and they were very smart people. They were working really hard. And I thought these Silicon Valley types, you know, they're throwing frisbees in the Stanford Quad, and you know, there's Stanford and Berkeley, but then there are people from some not as well-known schools, and it just didn't seem to me that there was anything magical about the people. And I'm sorry? All right, someone's talking back there, but sorry, I can't hear you. Sorry? It's good? Okay. Is there an issue? All right. So anyway, so I thought, okay, so people in Silicon Valley, they don't seem that extra special smart. So what is it? Well, if they can do it, then I can do it. And that's the thing about Silicon Valley. You get there, yes, they're smart people, yes, they're hardworking people, but there's nothing truly exceptional about them other than their ability to take risk and be creative. And so as soon as you figure that out, you say, wow, if that guy can get rich, so can I. If that guy can build something great, so can I. If she can accomplish that, so can I. So it gives you a role model with not an impossibly high bar to shoot for. So I don't think that any of these things should actually be gating items for entrepreneurship here in Malaysia, or for that matter, anywhere else in the world. And I want to go through them in some detail. But there is some bad news. The bad news is that the one thing you can do well in Silicon Valley is you can raise money. And you can raise money at a very early stage. You can raise a few $100,000, maybe $10,000 from a friend here or there, $50,000 from a coworker, a few $100,000 from an angel or super angel. And that has turned out to be very, very difficult to replicate anywhere else in the world. It's very hard to find a good angel ecosystem anywhere else in the world. And I think that's because of a very counterintuitive learning that I've had since we started AngelList. And that is that fundraising markets develop backwards. You think that the first thing that would pop up is incubators and angel investors. Then after that, based on their success, VCs would show up. And then after that, based on their success, later stage investors would show up. But the reality is that the way investors are very risk averse. And so the way that investing markets develop is first a country creates a public market where companies that have a 10-year history of operations and earnings can go out there and raise more capital. And then what happens is before these companies go public, some smart investor figures out, hey, maybe I can put in money 1 year before it goes public, and instead of having 8 quarters of profitability, it has 4 quarters of profitability, and I'm taking a little more risk, but I'm getting paid a lot more. And so then you get these private equity investors showing up. And then once the private equity guys are there, then the venture capitalists figure out, hey, maybe we should be involved as well, and we should be funding these companies before they're profitable, when they're on the cusp of being profitable. And then finally, angel investors show up, and then after that, incubators. So funding markets start with big money being available first, and little money comes last. And that's actually the bad news if you're an entrepreneur in a part of the world where there's not a mature funding market. Paul Graham, who started Y Combinator, originally started it in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in Boston, which he thought was a mature enough funding market, but what he learned very quickly was that there were not enough angel investors there to support the companies that he was graduating. So he would graduate these companies, then they couldn't raise money, and they would go under. And so he moved very quickly to Silicon Valley, which is the most mature funding market in the world. So my learning from that is that although capital is mobile, capitalists are lazy. And capital and angel investing is fundamentally a people business. You invest in people that you know, that you meet, that you get to like over time. And so because of that, capital itself does not flow very quickly because the people allocating the capital at the early stage for angel investments don't move around a lot. So it is actually very dangerous to start at the bottom. So if you're opening an incubator in Malaysia, for example, your biggest fear is, who are the angel investors who are going to fund my companies after I graduate them? And until you can answer that question, you cannot actually create a good full-blown ecosystem for startups. So now here's the good news. The good news is that Silicon Valley itself has relied upon, to a large degree, information arbitrage to be the only place in the world to date where lots and lots of successful startup companies have been built. But that is changing because that information advantage is going away thanks to the web. Michael Lewis, who's a very well-known author, points out repeatedly that by its very nature, the internet spreads information. And it undermines anybody, whether it's venture capitalist, whether it's Silicon Valley, whether it's an established company, that relies on privileged access to information. And that is true for Silicon Valley itself. So I think sometime over the next decade or two, we are going to see the emergence of good, rich startup ecosystems around the world. Not to take away from Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley still has that certain magic to it. But just like you can now make movies outside of Hollywood, as in Bollywood or in Seoul, or there are other rich ecosystems popping up, you will be able to create companies, successful technology companies, that have a global impact in other parts of the world. And what is going to enable that? Well, Silicon Valley had the best weather. Let's face it, that's not the most important thing. I think many times locals want to stay local. I can say just from my last few days here, the food here is phenomenal. And if you're used to having your laksa or your Penang curry, you don't want to go to Silicon Valley. It's not necessarily the best way to live. It's actually a funny story, but when I first moved to Silicon Valley, I found that a lot of the Indian entrepreneurs who had moved there from India, when they had retired, they would actually open up Indian restaurants that reminded them of their native food, something that they've been dying to do for 10 or 15 years while working away. And just like Berkeley and Stanford get a lot of credit, there are actually an enormous amount of great universities all over the world. The IITs in India are graduating some very high quality people. There are incubators popping up. As I said, they're the new graduate schools. And the web itself is a great school. There's so much you can learn on the web these days that it's not even necessary to have to go to the best formal education. MIT has all of its curriculum open on open courseware. There's Khan Academy. There's many sites that have sprung up that teach people how to code and make them better at it very quickly. The huge local markets that the U.S. used to enjoy are now in Asia. So I think a lot of us in Silicon Valley are trying to figure out how to reach Asia, and Malaysia is very lucky in being one of the few gateways to Asia. Capital is, of course, a big issue. There's not the established venture community here to the same level that we have in California, but it's gotten a lot cheaper to do a startup. It's very low cost or almost no cost, and that is the saving grace in that regard. Ecosystem of entrepreneurs is very important. You need to have other entrepreneurs to lean on. Now, the fact there are hundreds and hundreds of entrepreneurs in this room is very heartening, so you obviously have your local groups and chapters, but you can also import them. The government of Chile has set up a very cool program called Startup Chile, where they pay foreign entrepreneurs to bring their companies to Chile for 6 months. And those companies come there, they build their products in Chile, the local people work alongside them and learn the spirit of entrepreneurship, and then create their own companies. And we see this because at AngelList, now we're starting to get indigenous Chilean companies applying for funding that are every bit as good as their Silicon Valley counterparts, because they've had the bar set by working very closely with these Silicon Valley teams who were down there for 6-month stints. And finally, this culture of risk and creativity that Silicon Valley gets a lot of credit for, I think it's starting to be felt all around the world. In our meetings over the last few days, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Education and others have pointed out that culture of risk-taking and creativity is very, very important. And I think they want to foster it. This is not Singapore, so I don't think you're going to get caned, if your startup fails. So I don't think you have to worry about that. But at the same time, I think people are realizing what's the risk, what's the harm. If I start a company and I spend a year on it and it fails, what did I really lose? I learned a lot. I didn't end up in jail. So it worked out pretty well. And then finally, this history of success thing, that's a big deal. It's very important to have role models. And one role model is to watch somebody else becoming successful next to you. So I'm actually really looking forward to the panel that has the local head of Groupon Malaysia and so forth on it, because I think those people can serve as role models for you and show you that, and I hope that you look at them and you'll respect them for what they've done, but you'll also say, him? Well, if he can do it, I can do it. And that's really all there is to it. Skype, by the way, did that for Estonia. Estonia, seems like it's a bit of a backwater. It's out in Eastern Europe. To someone from far away, it doesn't look any different from Lithuania or Latvia or what have you. But they're churning out these incredibly high-quality companies because Skype was founded there, and there are a lot of ex-Skype engineers there, and they've just set a high bar for themselves. So it just takes one success case, one big success, and all of a sudden you can create this little ecosystem of entrepreneurship and creativity. In the meantime, while you're sitting here and you're waiting for all of this to fan out, of course you have to keep working and create your company. So what can you do? What can you do that's different? What can you do that's better? What can you do that maybe the rest of the world is not willing to do? And one thing I would argue is that more so than at any other point in the history of our society, code is power. It is the new literacy. The personal computer is the most powerful tool ever invented by mankind since maybe the fire or the stone axe. And I would put it above the steam engine. I would put it above flight. I would put it above cars. I would put it above electricity. And the reason is because all those other things were group efforts. You needed somebody else's permission to use those tools. Even a printing press, no individual could run the printing press on their own, or you would have publishers in the way. The personal computer and the internet are the first time since the invention of fire or the stone axe where you can do it all by yourself with nobody else's permission. If you were sitting by yourself in your dorm room and you write a piece of software that everybody else in the world wants to have and wants to use, they don't care that you did it by yourself. So in that sense, even if you're not going to be a developer, and I'm not a developer anymore, it's been 7 years since I've written serious code, it's still very important that you understand how these tools work. It is the equivalent of carrying a torch in the darkness and lighting the area around you, and everybody else is plunged in darkness. I believe it is a new form of literacy. I think it's as important as reading, writing, and arithmetic, and I think 30 or 50 years from now, if you are not computer literate, you will essentially be illiterate. So I encourage you to get out in front of it. The good news is it's gotten a lot easier. If you were intimidated by computers 5 or 10 years ago, I encourage you to revisit it. The new programming languages and infrastructure that's out there, Ruby on Rails, Python, completely online systems for learning from Code Academy and Code Lesson to running your code in the cloud, it's actually gotten quite easy. It's easier than learning a new language. So I encourage you all to give it a shot. Even if you're going to be accounting or if you're going to be listen to your parents and go into medicine or law or what have you, you will still be far advanced because of that. And the beauty of it is not only can you do this on your own and you can learn this very important tool, but now it can be spread not to millions of computers, as used to be the case, but now to billions of computers. I'm shocked to see how many iPhones I've seen in Malaysia. It's incredible. Everyone seems to be carrying one. So this is your target market. You can create something that can end up in everybody's pocket, and they're using it 100 times a day. In fact, I think half the front row is bored of me by now and is on their iPhones. It's free leverage, no license required, no permission needed. So if you think of yourself as disempowered, this is the most empowering thing possible in the world. And it accounts for the Silicon Valley unemployment paradox, which is the entire United States as a whole is running a 10%, near 10% unemployment rate, and it's a severe recession. But in Silicon Valley itself, there are too few people, too many jobs available, and housing prices are continuing to go up. And a lot of that is happening because of the incredible power that coders have, and so companies are doing whatever they can to recruit them. Mark Andreessen very famously said, he penned an article in the Wall Street Journal where he said, software is eating the world. And what he means by that is because of mobile phones being ubiquitous in everybody's pocket, the new generation of developers and hackers and coders is essentially attacking and remaking every major industry on the planet. There's a Y Combinator company called Airbnb, which announced that this year they will have more private rooms for rent all around the world than Hilton worldwide does. So just a few years after launch, they're bigger than Hilton. There's a company called Uber, which provides a black car taxi service. They compete with a taxi service in San Francisco, and they're probably deploying more cabs than any single taxi fleet in San Francisco 1 year into operations. So basically, using code and computing, hackers are now going after established industries. Software is eating the world. So it doesn't matter almost what part of the world you want to innovate in, what you want to replace, you can do it through software and code. And so my challenge to Malaysia or to any country looking to remake itself for the modern age is that you have the opportunity to become a society of coders, which I think would be incredible if you could stand up and say, yes, our entire working age population or graduates is computer literate. They don't necessarily have to code for their job, of course, but but having that computer literacy gives you a level of power and credibility that nobody else can. So finally, I want to end with just a little bit on doing your own startup companies, and I know it's a bit of a non sequitur, but I feel like a lot of you are here because you are doing your own startup. So you're trying to say, well, how can I make it more successful? How can I be successful in Malaysia? Given what we've learned, what can you do? So I just want to lay out kind of my formula for starting a company. And I've started 7 companies now, and I always kind of run through this checklist, and I fail every time. And the most important thing is there are no formulas, right? At the end of the day, you have to do what you love, and you have to do it even though people tell you it'll never work. But that being said, if there was a formula, I would put it something like this, and I think it applies everywhere in the world. It applies in Malaysia, it applies in Silicon Valley. The most important thing is pick a great co-founder. You can do a company on your own, but it's like you can, in theory, raise a child on your own, but you probably shouldn't. So you need someone who's going to be there with you. And a co-founder is someone who's going to have very high intelligence, very high energy, and very high integrity. The intelligence is a given. These people should be very smart. Hopefully they make you feel dumb, or they're not smart enough. They should be extremely hardworking. A founder is someone who never has to be motivated. You should not have to be telling them to do their job. And the integrity piece is important because if you get the other 2 and you don't get the 3rd, then you've got a smart, hardworking crook who's going to cheat you. And that's the worst kind of person to be paired up with. You need to pick a very large market, and I think that is an advantage that you have on the doorstep to Asia that the rest of us do not in Silicon Valley. The markets here are much, much larger, and they're growing much, much faster. So pick something that's very large so you can grow into it. Notice I don't talk about the idea. I think ideas are almost irrelevant. There are lots and lots of smart people who sit around and have ideas all day long. Ideas are worthless. I can give you 1,000 good ideas after this meeting. Come up and ask me. But the more important thing is that you pick a large space that you're knowledgeable and passionate about, and then you will figure out what the right thing to do within that space is. Do not go around telling people, I have a great idea, now give me money. That never works. It's rather you should say, this is a space where there's a huge market. I'm really knowledgeable and passionate about it. Here are the kinds of things that I could do. Here's the great person that I have doing it with me. And here's the minimum viable product that we have built that will show that we can test in the marketplace. So basically, you do want to build something. Thanks to all the leverage that I talked about, you can actually build and deploy something before you go and raise money, especially if you have good coders on your team. You can iterate it to the point where you get what Andreessen calls product market fit, where your product matches up to what the market needs. And then you go and you raise money from people you trust, and you use that money to scale. So that's basically it. Here to talk about the revolution that happened in Silicon Valley, and I think how it's rolling on to the rest of the world. And I think it's an inspirational message. So that's it. I'm open for questions if anyone wants them.
We've set up microphones around the hall, so if you get to one of the microphones, identify yourself and pose your question to Naval.
Hi. Over here. You're right. Okay. Thanks a lot for sharing all your knowledge to all Malaysians here. My name is Melvin. I just want to ask, we've tried to approach a lot of VCs and angels outside of Malaysia, Australia, UK, even the US, and those people who like our idea, they always tell us this one reason that we are too far away. And I understand from VCs and angels that they always want to be near to their money. So would you encourage Malaysians to go overseas or to go to Silicon Valley, start a small office and try to raise funds?
Yeah, that's actually the single biggest problem you're going to face as a company here, which is even when you have good product and traction and team, people will say you're too far away. And at the end of the day, investing is a people business. So they want to get to know you, and they want to know they can help you through their networks and introductions and kind of keep an eye on you and their money. So how do you get past that? It's a really hard problem. There are multiple things you can try. The first is you can get a local investor who maybe does not put in most of the money, but has good overseas connections and is well trusted, and then people can say, okay, well, there's a local investor, and then we'll come in as the foreign money. That one's hard to pull off. The second thing you could try and do is just get further along. there's a point at which your business becomes more numerical and less about people. And at that point, people will be investing more in the numbers of the business than the people of the business. But the best solution, I think, these days, that's very common, the Estonian companies are doing this a lot, for example, is they will have a founding team of between 2 to 4 people, and 1 or 2 of the founders will move to Silicon Valley or to New York or to London. And they won't necessarily even do it full-time. They'll be there 6 months out of the year, but they'll be there often enough they can establish a relationship with investors and do business development over there. So you can set up kind of an office in that area, but it's important that that office include a founder or a very senior member of the management team. Next question.
Good morning, Mr. Naval. Thank you for the great sharing. I'm Waikit, a student in computer science, and my question goes like this. What are the important or key criteria that you look for before you decide to invest in these ideas? Thank you.
Yeah, so what are the important criteria when you look to invest in a company? So the process of raising money from an investor is, a friend of mine once joked, he said it's the process of young men and women seducing old men and women. You're essentially trying to get them to look at you and to see themselves in you and say, oh, yeah, that's just like me. That's just how I think. I would do that if I wasn't so busy. The reality is I'm lazy now, but I would do that if I wasn't so busy. And so it is an emotional sale. It is not a rational sale. And you have to understand that it's core level. And the way emotional sales work is people get emotionally sold not based on checklists. It's very rare to fall in love with someone you say, well, yeah, it's pretty good looking, and he's pretty nice, and he's pretty smart, and it doesn't work like that. Usually there is one thing about the person that is so overwhelming that makes you want to fall in love with them. And the same way, when an investor is deciding to make an investment in a startup, they usually look for one exceptional characteristic about the startup that they truly, truly adore. So there are 4 categories, I think, of things in which you can really excel. And it's important to be reasonable in all of them, but you want to just knock it out of the park. You want to be very, very good in one of them. And so those 4 categories normally are team, which is, do you have a really high quality team, very smart people who have obviously accomplished good things, gone to good schools, or have just built neat things in their spare time. The school thing is actually a little overrated. That's actually less important. It's more about just what have you done. If you can show that you have done something exceptional other than starting this company, that's a huge thing. Y Combinator, in fact, I think their main screening question is, besides starting this company, what is the most important thing you've done in your life? Or what is the most impressive thing you've done in your life? So be prepared to answer that question. The second thing is product. If you've built a product, it should look and feel good and be slick and high quality. I think a lot of entrepreneurs make the mistake where they show investors sort of half-finished products or not working products and then try and explain their way around it. The reality is investors are users also, so they're highly visual. They want to see it, they want to play with it, and they'll make up their mind very quickly. Customer traction matters a lot, so if you have customers, if you have users, if those users are organically joining and growing, that's very good. If you have to basically say, give us money and then I'll go get customers, they don't like to hear that. And then finally, there's this thing called social proof. Social proof is basically looking at what other people are doing and doing that. So in the investing context, what it means is if you have one investor committed, very often you can get more investors interested. Or if you have a famous entrepreneur or an advisor who's very knowledgeable involved with a company, that can help bring in investors. So those are the 4 criteria that I think most investors look at, and you really want to be exceptional at least one of them.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Naval. I'm Deep. I'm a big fan of you. It's great to see you here live and listening to you.
Thank you.
Okay. You just said, and I have heard this 100 times, ideas are useless or worthless or whatever you want to call it. My question is that wherever I go, I see 99% startups are in the consumer side, and I feel myself a bit aloof because I'm in the enterprise. I'm trying to do CRM kind of application. I have a big market, I have a bit of attraction, I got a ready product, but no one wants to invest in me. I'm not even in the top 100 startups who are selected here today. So I just want to know, what do you think about the enterprise startups? Is there still some kind of, is there still an option for those guys to survive or not?
I actually think enterprise startups are doing well in the Silicon Valley ecosystem. Investors like companies that can make money very quickly. But you have to be an enterprise software startup that is doing something interesting, that is fun, that is new, that is dynamic. You have to take lessons from the consumer side and bring them to the enterprise. What you don't want to build is a boring enterprise startup, frankly. Believe it or not, a lot of the reason why investors gravitate towards consumer startups is because they themselves use consumer apps. And with enterprise startups, you don't want to give them an app that looks clunky and old and hard to use. So the enterprise startups that do well these days are the ones that take on a lot of consumer features and go for ease of use. I'll give you two examples. One is Yammer. If you've used that product, it's modeled very much after Twitter, but it's an enterprise company. But the product is beautifully designed, it's very simple, it's very easy to use, and people can see that it's taking the best of consumer technology and bringing that into the enterprise. Another example is we had a company on AngelList that did quite well. It's called Pipedrive. And they're going after Salesforce, so they're doing a CRM for salespeople. The whole model they went after is they said, well, what if Apple had designed Salesforce? Then it would be this beautiful, slick, easy-to-use app that anyone could just fire up and use right away. So I think when you bring design elements into enterprise software and you bring something fresh and new, people will want to work with you. If, on the other hand, what you're basically saying is, I'm making a small tweak and then there's a long sales cycle and most of my value is in selling, then I think investors are less interested in that. If more of your value is in design and technology, then I think you can break out of that loop. At the end of the day, I think there are actually more investors who are looking for good enterprise companies than consumer companies, because a lot of the experienced investors realize that the consumer companies are, there's 1 out of 100 that works. The odds are very, very low, and they don't make money for a long, long time. And especially in parts of the world like this, where there are less liquid capital markets, it's better to have a company that can make money very quickly and won't need VC financing all the way down the road.
Thank you.
Hello. Naval, okay, thanks a lot for your presentation. Okay, I have 2 questions. The first one, as somebody who has seen something, somebody who has invested in startups like Twitter, Foursquare, you seem to have the Midas touch, where you can see something that is going to be huge. Maybe you also have some wrong investment decisions in the past, but in your opinion, in the next 5 to 10 years, what kind of startups or what kind of services or applications that, in your opinion, can be big, can be huge? My second question is about fear, about uncertainties, because for small startups, one of the main concerns is that when somebody is investing in their products, in their startups, they fear that they are going to give away everything that they have worked so hard. So what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, so it's a 2-part question. First is something about what's the next Twitter. If I knew it, I'd invest in it, I'd start it. The reality is, I think in part of my bio, they picked out 2 companies that I've invested in out of 60. And the good news is when I invested in Twitter, I thought it was going to be huge, but I thought the other 59 were going to be huge also, or I wouldn't have invested in them. So there's an enormous amount of luck in this business. Enormous. I mean, even looking back, I probably still couldn't explain to you why Twitter worked, even though it has worked to date. So anyone who tells you that they know what they're doing when they make these investments is basically lying. I think what you can do as an investor is you can remove some of the obvious losers, but once you've removed the obvious losers, it's very hard to pick winners out of the remaining set. In terms of what's going to be huge in the future, I don't know. You'll figure it out. If I had to guess, it has something to do with the mobile phone in your pocket. It has something to do with the fact that that phone has probably 11 or 12 sensors on it that are on all the time, everything from a gyroscope to a GPS to the cell tower triangulation to accelerometers and so on. Someone is going to very cleverly use those to stitch things together and do amazing things with phones that we can't even imagine. So I think there will probably be something good in that area. But the reality is there's so much to be done. Going back to the Danny Hillis' definition of technology is a set of things that doesn't work yet. A lot of things don't work yet. Most things don't work yet. So I think there's an enormous room for innovation. Things like Twitter and YouTube and LinkedIn and some of our illustrious colleagues get put in the highlights, but there are things that are just as innovative, that have transformed the world in just as radical ways that aren't as famous. There's back-end logistics software that I'm sure has completely remade entire parts of the value chain. Kiva, what they do with nonprofit microfunding, is just an incredible resource. So the innovation is everywhere. It's in the air that we breathe. I couldn't predict. The bit about ideas, someone was I think the second part was, what about exposing your idea and someone runs off with it? Whatever your idea is, Google it. It's already out there.
Cal here with Tandem. So one of the things that seems to be a big issue, at least in this part of the world, is exits for angel investors. And what I'm wondering is, to what extent do you see your network growing outside of the United States, and especially into Asia? What do you think are hotspots here? And how do you think that angel investors in these parts of the world are coping with that issue that exits are really hard? Are they looking at alternative things to get out of startups? Are they looking at different kinds of timelines when they make investments? How do we basically entice these angels in this context here?
Yeah, the short answer is I don't know. It's a really hard problem. When we started AngelList, part of our vision was to enable and democratize investing all around the world. The reality is that investors don't invest where they aren't physically. So the most we managed to do was get to New York investors to invest in California, California investors to invest in New York. It doesn't help the problem here. About half of our volume is in Silicon Valley, but about 90% is in the United States. We have gotten an Indian startup funded by Indian investors. We have gotten a Swiss startup funded. So there are a few that kind of float around outside. But the reality is that angels don't want to invest outside of their spheres. On the M&A side, I think the answer is a little better, the exit side, which is that a lot of these companies are realizing that they need to go global more and more quickly. So they open up branch offices all around the world. So people like Groupon and Google and LinkedIn and so on have had to buy local counterparts in many cases. And at the beginning, I think they were buying just the local clone. So they were saying, okay, well, I've got LinkedIn US, I need Germany, I'm going to buy LinkedIn Germany. But I think now they're realizing that they need talent. Talent and smart engineers and developers and designers are the scarce thing. So we're going to see talent acquisitions. We're going to see acquisitions that are in slightly other categories. That still doesn't completely answer the question. I'm hoping that those will not be the only kinds of exits for angels here. The problem with Groupon buying a Groupon here is that it encourages people here to just do what's been done there. It sort of de-risks the whole process, but it doesn't allow for maximum creativity. The problem with talent acquisition is it tend to be fairly cheap. It's very hard for an investor to make a good return on a talent acquisition. So what I'm hoping instead is that what we'll see is that forward-looking large companies here will realize that they need to start acquiring those smaller companies. And they don't necessarily have to be traditional tech companies. So for example, Maxis, the big cell phone carrier here, should be looking at acquiring companies that are in iPhone or cell phone or Android technology areas. That started happening in the United States actually in force in 2000, then sort of the bubble burst. I think we're going to see a second coming of that. We're going to see more of the media and publishing and news companies buying up technology companies. So those are all hopes. Those are not real. I don't know how it's going to play out. But what's going to happen is a lot of angel investors in this part of the world are going to lose a lot of money until the cycle turns and the big companies start buying the small companies, and the investors who happen to be there at the right time will make an enormous amount of money. So that's why you get paid nothing.
Naval, morning. It's Bernard here from JMX. We have just, a couple of months back, we just completed our first round of fundraising. And that has taught me a lot of experience, in the sense that we managed to raise it from the Valley and also in Cape Town. Now, what happened is, the one thing I noticed about local in Malaysia is that the appetite, there's a very poor appetite of local investors. What do you think about that? And how can we build an ecosystem that investors have better appetite locally for startups? That's my first question. My second question is, as students, I mean, I used to be a student. Now, as students, and as we graduate and we go on a startup, it seems like we've been always taught to go after government fundings. My partner from Cape Town, when he came down to Malaysia, and when we were discussing about fundraising, I said, hey, let's hit the governments, the governments can give us money. He was shocked, he looked surprised. He's like, your government give you money? And I think it's a mindset that the education system has inculcated into us, You got a big idea, great idea, sell it to the government give you grants. And I think one of the scenario here is that most of the grant recipients on startups, or rather not most, maybe a lot of them, doesn't really fly after their grant period finish. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so two questions. First is, how do we encourage more local angel investors? And second is, what's the role of government and how can it be effective in providing entrepreneurs capital? In terms of the first question, how do you encourage local investors? Well, investors angel investors are rich people who have extra money to throw around, and they think they understand startups. So the best way to get those people is to have successful startups that create those rich people who have extra money to throw around. For example, in Silicon Valley, when Google goes public, it suddenly created thousands of angel investors because all of a sudden you have all these employees at Google who made all this money and they don't quite know how they made it and they don't quite know how to invest it, and they have all these friends next door who are starting companies and they say, well, I kind of made my money through a tech company and he's starting a tech company, so why not? So that's not a great answer for you because you can't solve that problem right away, but I would encourage you to remember it when your company is hopefully successful someday, and then you can invest in the next generation. You can take people who are already successful and sort of educate them on angel investing, but it's a hard problem. Paul Graham at Y Combinator used to do that every year with his conference that he called Angel Conf, where he would bring in successful angels to talk to people who are thinking about becoming angels, and they would teach them, essentially. But that's a long, slow process. In terms of the role of government, that's a really hard one. I think with the problem with government grants is that they are not always allocated on merit. They're allocated for political purposes. And so the question there is, can the government... I didn't mean anything against the current government. But it's very true in the U.S. I think in the U.S., the only people who bother to go and get government grants are the ones who are in research universities, they're working on politically popular programs, they're connected and so on. And those companies tend not to be successful because they got money for the wrong reasons. So they're trained to operate in the wrong way. But that's not to say that the government cannot make a good difference. The government can allocate capital well as long as it allocates it through private hands. So there's been a program in the U.S. for a long time called the Small Business Investment Corporation arm. And so they actually give money to private equity, and private equity invests that money in startups. Although that's becoming less relevant now because the U.S. market for private equity is so healthy. But those public-private partnership models can work, assuming that they're truly arm's length. The people who are doing the private stuff themselves are not sort of bought off or corrupt or what have you. So, it's a hard problem, but at least everything I heard from the Prime Minister and from the other people here was that they want to solve that and they're thinking about that the right way. But let's see.
Thanks, Naval. You hit on a nail. Appreciate it.
Hi, Naval. Sharif from T-Daily. So most startups, the case with most startups is valuation is part art and science. When, as an early startup, what would be the best way to go around raising money? Is it just giving away equity for some fund, or is it convertible bond, or is there any other option out there?
In Silicon Valley, people use both convertible debt or equity, but the convertible debt is just a shortcut for equity because they put a price on what it's going to convert at. I don't think it really matters that much, to be honest. Just go with whatever your investor is comfortable with and the terms are fair. What's more important is that you need to just create a great product and make progress to the point where people want to fund you, and then those little things go away. The choice of equity versus debt is never going to stand in the way of you raising money. It's going to be more fundamental things, like do you have a great team, do you have a great product?
Hi, Noel. I'm Ryan Harris from Warehouse.com. My company is still new, and it's actually a service-based company. I just want to know, people have been talking about investors, getting investors to invest in the startup. What about if you have an idea? that is a service-based? Should it pledge it to the people first, then see the response and pledge your investment to investors, or should we pledge it to investors first, then to the public?
Yeah, so service-based companies, it's harder to raise money for them because they have less leverage. If you go back to what I was talking about, leverage through code and so on, there's less of a code composition, there's more of a people composition, less leverage, lower margins. Investors tend not to like it as much. That being said, service-based businesses do get funded by investors. It's rarer. They usually have to be a lot further along, and you have to be able to demonstrate that there's a very strong intellectual property component to what you do. To give you an example, if you look at Goldman Sachs or an investment bank, it's a service business. But it's a service business where each individual has a lot of power and expertise. You have to hire very expensive individuals, and then you sell them for very expensive rates. Those kinds of businesses are not fundable by investors. If you look at McDonald's, every individual is replaceable because they've figured out how to franchise the system so that you can just hire a new person and run them on the same playbook. So there's a lot of intellectual property in McDonald's business model. So even though it's a service-based business, there's a lot of intellectual property in there, and that becomes more of a financeable business. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but if you're in the services space, you want to maximize your intellectual property component. And you want to show a little bit of traction that you can do it in a replicated way with different people before you go and raise money.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hello. Hi. Just a general question about lean startups and bootstrapping a company as soon as possible, and general things along those lines.
Yeah, you know, the lean startup movement has gotten a lot of good press, and it sounds great. I'm not that familiar with it other than do things cheaply and quickly. Yeah, absolutely. Right, it's something every startup should do. I don't, you know, entrepreneurs inherently are independent, strong-willed, forceful people. And so it's unlikely that a great entrepreneur is going to be the same person who sits in a class and gets instruction on how to build a lean startup and follows it line by line. So I encourage you not to get caught up in movements or you know, instructional movements or details or memorization or terminology. But I think you can take a lot from the lean startup movement, and I give them a lot of credit for basically saying, stay small until you figure out what's working. Steve Blank, who teaches at Stanford and started Epiphany, among many other companies, he defines a startup very nicely. He says a startup is a search for a scalable and repeatable business model. And so what you're really doing is you're searching. And until you found that business model that you can repeat and you can scale, you should stay very, very small and very, very cheap. So I think that right there tells you a lot about the lean startup movement and what you can take from it.
My name is Mohammad Dahan. I'm with a research company doing both market and political research. But my question is on entrepreneurship education in universities at the higher level. So in this country, we have about 25 universities with entrepreneurship and innovation centers. But on the other hand, I see most of the billionaires in the US, they drop out of universities.
Right.
So what's your advice to the local universities here with the entrepreneurship and innovation centers? Thank you.
It's actually a great question, and you know that gives me hope because universities in the U.S. are not asking that question. And basically, what you're saying is we have a lot of universities, we have research arms and departments, but it seems like all successful entrepreneurs are dropouts. So what do we do? Well, the good news is that, as I mentioned earlier, these incubators are the new graduate schools. And a lot of the forward-looking campuses have the incubators popping up there. So Berkeley has Founder School, Stanford has StartX, and a new one that's coming up. And I think that you can embrace those, you can foster those. You should send people to the best of these schools, to Y Combinator, to Techstars, to IO, to AngelPad, find Paul Bragiel over here and ask him how he runs IO Ventures, and recreate that in the university. And you'll find it's shockingly cheap. And it's really easy. And what it's going to do is it's going to create wealth so quickly that it'll become a profit center for the university. So I think that's the new model. These people have devised a new model to accelerate and create entrepreneurs. And yes, some of them end up as dropouts. But really, if they came to school, they met their co-founder, they learned how to build a company, they got their funding to build a company, they launched the company, did they really drop out, or did they learn better than their peers? I would argue that these people that we call dropouts actually got a better education than the people who stayed in school. And so the university deserves credit for that. So just enable it.
I hope to arrange for you to meet the Ministry of Higher Education. Thank you.
Naval, just
hello.
before you take your next question,
Hello, yeah.
we're running a little bit short on time, so whoever's already at the microphone, we can take all those questions, and then we'll have to cut this session short after that. All right?
Hello. Okay, hi. Hello, yeah.
On your right. So hi, I'm Elisha. I'm from Singapore. I just want to know if you're interested in investing in this region. And if you do, of the 4 factors that you just mentioned, which are the factors that you care most about? Like, do you care more about traction or team?
Sure.
Or?
I think at the end of the day, every smart investor cares the most about the team. Because, excuse me, investors are not entrepreneurs. Any investor who thinks that they can look over the entrepreneur's shoulders and tell them what to do and solve their problems is deluding themselves. So you just have to back the best people. And to the extent they've built a product or gotten traction, that's their resume that helps you evaluate the team, but it's really about the team. Am I interested in investing in this region? Absolutely. This is where all the markets are. This is where all the money is being made. This is where the future is. Would I make any money doing it? No, I'd lose my shirt because I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know the people. I don't know who's telling me the truth. I don't know who's connected. I don't know what the right product for the market is. I don't even speak the language. I barely eat the food. So I would lose. If I was truly serious about investing in this region, I would move here, I would spend 5 years here, and I wouldn't invest $1 or a nickel or a ringgit until I'd figured it out. And so it's a hard problem.
So you're not going to invest in this region pretty soon, I guess?
I might, but it's going to be based on people I already know. So, for example, I invested in a company in Russia, but it was an entrepreneur, Russian entrepreneurs who had been in Silicon Valley for a few years, and they were moving back to Moscow to start a company. So you need that linkage of trust.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hello, yeah. I have a question here. Okay, my name is Ramad. Thank you. My name is Ramad. We run a startup here. Let's now imagine you already come to Malaysia and become an investor. Okay, now in front of you there's companies looking for fund. Okay, my question is, what would be 3 most critical strategies that you'll be looking for this company? You know, for their product development and for their marketing.
I'm sorry, can you just repeat the first part of the question?
What would be the 3 most important strategies that you'll be looking for, you know, that this company will be having, you know, in terms of their product development and marketing for you to consider investing?
What are the 3 most important strategies for a company that I would look for in investing in them?
Yes, correct, sir.
You know, it's hard to answer generically. It's hard to answer that question in the abstract. I'd have to see and know the company. But really, you're looking for, at the end of the day, as an investor, you're looking for really smart people who have thought through the problem, care about it, and have figured out the answers. Or if they haven't figured out the answers, they're honest about it. Usually, you sit down with a company, you set up a half-hour or 60-minute meeting, you know within 3 to 5 minutes if this company knows what they're doing, if the people know what they're doing, if they're backable. It comes across very, very quickly. So if you're spending your time preparing, learning how to pitch, figuring out how to position, you're sort of wasting your time. You need to figure out your business. And if you know your business cold, then you will be able to tell the investor and there won't be many problems. So I wouldn't spend too much time thinking about strategy and pitching and all that stuff. I would actually just figure out how to make money, how to build a great product that people want to buy in volume, and think through all the corner cases around it. Focus on product. I've learned that in my life. You know, 2 years ago, nobody would have invited me to start up Malaysia. I was nobody. Yeah, I'd made a few investments, but I created a product called AngelList, which is why I'm up here today. And this is probably the first trip I've done since I started AngelList because I was so busy on AngelList. And even today, you know, I get up at early in the morning, every morning, I work for a few hours on AngelList because that's my passion, that's my baby. And so it's only because of product that you get anything else. So just focus on your product.
Hi, this is not a funding question. My name is Melinda. I'm from Coconut. It's actually referring to your AngelList. Just now you mentioned a CRM company that is the Apple of Salesforce. I've totally missed the company name. That's my question number one. Question number two is, they sound like the company that we like to collaborate with because we provide a online relationship building solution. Utterly simple, very fun. So one of the ways we grow is via integrating with CRM companies. They are our buddies. So we like to probably explore working with them. So how can I get in touch with them?
Oh, yeah, the company's name is Pipe Drive.
Pipe Drive?
Yeah, and I can get you the information afterwards. I don't think they want their email broadcast to the whole world.
All right, thank you.
Hello. Hi, I'm Kamar. You mentioned all of those startups. I think most startups are in two types. One is commercialized research from grad students in universities. The other one is the startup where people have ideas and they work on it and later on pitch to investors. But in Malaysia, the government have shifted, I think, the past 1 year, where if I want to apply for incentives or anything, it has to be a commercialization of research and development that is being done at a university. So do you think this hybrid model could work, or is it better because the requirement was that all of this research would then apply for IP, and then companies or interested individuals can work with universities, license the product and commercialize it? Because I'm not sure how the ownership of the IP will influence venture capitals and angels alike.
Yeah, it's a very sophisticated question about what is the best way to work with university IP and research. And I don't have an answer to it really, because it's so dependent on your local laws and universities and what kinds of work they're doing and what the market needs. In the US, both kinds of companies have been built. There are great companies that have taken research and spun out of universities. Usually it's for more fundamental technologies in biotech or semiconductors or maybe large-scale databases. And at the same time, there are lots and lots of great companies, many more, that have had nothing to do with university research. So I think both models are viable, but it really depends on what you are doing. I certainly wouldn't constrain myself into just one model.
But combination of the models, can it work?
Sure. Depends on you, I think. Yeah, there's nothing inherently wrong with the model.
We have one last question at the back.
Hi, my name is Bestman Henry. I'm a foreign student here. I want to ask a question. Apart from the food, what other notable challenges did you face as a foreign investor or as a programmer in Silicon Valley? Because basically everything was like local, local, and local.
What are the challenges in Silicon Valley? Oh, there's many. It's intensely competitive. Everyone, their brother, their sister is starting a company. It's very hard to stand out from the noise. You're always getting recruited. I mean, the biggest problem for me as an entrepreneur is every time I decided to do a company, I had an offer to join a bigger company and make more money and do better. So you always have to look at that and say no. So there's always temptation all around you. Being an entrepreneur is a miserable process. I think if anyone here really understood how difficult it was, you wouldn't do it. You'd be insane to do it. There are easier ways to make money. You do it because you have to, because either you're incredibly stubborn and willfully independent, or you do it because you love the particular thing that you're passionate about. You just can't stand working for other people, whatever it is. But it's not easy. It's kind of miserable. I sort of have a bad entrepreneurial encounter every single day. Like every single day, something bad happens that makes me regret being an entrepreneur. And I think that's inherent in the process. I don't think it has anything to do with location. So you're always going to run into that. Startups are hard.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll have to close this session. Ladies and gentlemen, Naval Ravikant, what can I say?